The departure from Sylvaris did not feel like a goodbye, but rather a transition between two worlds. As Elian stood on the high balcony, the gift rain fell in silver needles, washing the last traces of shadow ash into the glistening canals of the city. Queen Valeriana, her presence as commanding as the ancient trees themselves, held out a palm. In it lay the Oath Stone, a heavy disk of dark magnetite, its surface etched with dwarven runes that pulsed with a low, subterranean, orange glow. The forest breathes, Starbearer, the queen whispered, her voice a melody of wind and leaves. But the stone beneath us is restless. The dwarves of Iron Peak have sent a whisper. Through the earth veins, a seal is weakening in the deep, and the rhythm of the world is faltering. Elian took the stone and tucked it safely into his pouch, feeling its unnatural coldness even through his gear. For a moment, he missed the warmth of the hearth and the profound silence of his books. But the ether light in his hand flared with a sudden, expectant brilliance. The light was no longer meant for comfort. It was meant for the uncertainty of the path. The first 3 days were a journey through a healing paradise. But as he pushed northward, the air began to sharpen. The sweet scent of blooming lilies was replaced by the biting aroma of dry pine and ancient granite. The ground, once soft with loam, became treacherous and flinty. By the end of the first week, the trees had surrendered to the altitude. They were replaced by jagged ridges that tore at the sky like the teeth of a giant. Elian climbed higher, his breath blooming in white clouds before him. Here, in the Iron Spine Mountains, the world was composed of only 2 colors, the slate gray of the rock and the blinding white of the eternal snows. Each step was a struggle against the thinning air, and the howling wind that seemed to scream warnings through the mountain passes. The Oathstone in his pouch grew heavier and warmer with every mile, its orange light flickering in rhythm with a deep, distant thrumming that came from beneath his boots. He was no longer walking on the skin of the world. He was climbing onto its bones. The ascent became a grueling battle against the mountain's very breath. As Elian climbed higher into the frozen pass, the lush world he had saved felt like a distant dream. He stopped to catch his breath, his lungs burning from the thin, icy air. The path grew narrower here, a ribbon of jagged stone suspended over white, bottomless abysses. Suddenly, the oath stone in his belt pouch began to pulse with a rapid, frantic heat, its orange light bleeding through the leather seams. Elian slowed his pace and raised the ether light. Through the swirling white curtain of the blizzard, a colossal shape emerged. It was a way marker, a 10-foot monolith of black granite, carved with geometric dwarven patterns that hummed in response to his lantern. As Elian reached out to brush the frost from the stone, a sharp, metallic ring echoed through the canyon, a sound like a hammer striking an anvil, but twisted and hollow. It didn't come from the wind. It came from the ridges above. He looked up, squinting through the snow. There, perched among the jagged rocks, sat a creature of brass and rusted iron, a scout automaton, a relic from the age when dwarves guarded these heights. Its single, glowing blue eye whirred as it focused on the golden light of Elian's lantern. It didn't attack. It simply watched, its gears clicking in a language Elian couldn't understand. The oath stone grew even warmer, vibrating against his side. The mountain was no longer a passive wall of rock. It was a waking giant, and Elian was being watched by eyes that hadn't seen a living soul in centuries. He gripped the handle of his lantern tighter, the sovereign spark pulsing with a warning, amber glow. He was no longer just a traveler. He was a messenger, entering a fortress that had forgotten its friends. The secret tunnel opened onto a massive stone bridge that spanned a dark, bottomless chasm. Across the void stood the true entrance to the kingdom, the great gates of Iron Peak. They were two gargantuan slabs of reinforced black iron, etched with ancient runes that glowed with a faint, pulsing heat. Elian stood before them, the howling wind of the outside world, now just a distant whisper. The scout automaton stopped and pointed toward a circular indentation at the very center of the iron gates, a lock that required no metal key. Elian reached into his leather pouch and pulled out the oath stone. As he approached the threshold, the orange runes on the stone began to hum, vibrating against his palm, as if the mountain itself was recognizing its master. With a steady hand, Elian pressed the stone into the circular socket. For a heartbeat, there was a heavy silence. Then, a series of thunderous, metallic clicks echoed from deep within the rock walls. The orange glow of the stone surged outward, flowing across the surface of the iron gates like liquid fire, awakening the ancient machinery inside. The titan-sized doors began to retreat, sliding into the mountain with a groan that shook the very ground Elian stood on. A blast of hot, metallic air, smelling of coal and molten iron, rushed out to meet him. Standing just beyond the threshold, illuminated by the orange furnace light, was a massive figure, clad in soot-stained plate armor, leaning on a wrench the size of a man. "The stone has spoken," the figure boomed, his voice as rough as grinding granite. "I am Thrain Ironfoot, keeper of the seal. You've come a long way, Star-bearer, but you've arrived just as the deep begins to bleed." Elian stepped through the gates, the oath stone returning to his hand as the heavy iron doors began to seal shut behind him. He was no longer a traveler of the surface. He was now a guest of the deep, and the real challenge was about to begin. "Step onto the plate, lad," Thrain commanded, gesturing toward a massive circular platform held by iron chains as thick as tree trunks. As Elian stepped on, the floor groaned and began a slow, rhythmic descent into the yawning abyss of the mountain. As they dropped, the scale of Iron Peak revealed itself. It wasn't just a mine, it was a vertical empire. Tens of thousands of lanterns flickered along the cavern walls, and bridges of stone arched over rivers of flowing lava that hummed with a primal energy. But as Elian looked closer at the majestic basalt pillars passing them by, he saw something that made the ether light in his hand pulse with unease. Jagged, glowing fissures were spiderwebbing across the ancient masonry. Unlike the warm orange of the lava below, these cracks bled a sickly, pulsating violet light, a color that felt alien to the earth. "The mountain is being poisoned from below," Thrain said, his voice unusually quiet as he watched the violet cracks. The great seal in the deep forge was meant to hold back the core breakers, beings of pure, unstable energy from the world's birth. But since your forest woke up, the pressure down here has become unbearable. The platform hit the bottom with a heavy thud. Before them lay the great forge, a cathedral of industry where hundreds of dwarves worked frantically, not to craft weapons, but to weld massive iron plates over the glowing cracks in the floor. "Your lantern, boy," Thrain said, pointing to the ether light. "It's not just a light source here. It's a stabilizer. If we don't get you to the heart core soon, the very floor we're standing on will turn into glass." Just as Elian stepped off the platform, a violent tremor shook the forge. A massive crack ripped through the floor between them, and a hiss of violet steam erupted, carrying with it a sound like 1,000 whispers. As the violet steam erupted, the air in the great forge grew impossibly cold, and 1,000 overlapping whispers began to claw at the edges of Elian's mind. Thrain surged forward, his massive wrench clanging against the stone floor to steady himself as the fissure widened, vomiting a thick, necrotic, purple mist. "The core breakers," Thrain roared over the screeching metal. "They are no longer just pressing against the seal. They are tasting the air." Elian raised the ether light, and as the golden radiance struck the violet fog, The mist recoiled with a hiss of pure agony. The sovereign spark within the lantern flared into a protective amber dome, pushing back the shadows that threatened to swallow the platform. "We cannot hold the forge," Thrain shouted, grabbing Elian by the shoulder and steering him toward a low, reinforced archway behind the basalt pillars. "The great forge is a battlefield now. We must take the old vein to reach the hardcore before the mountain turns to glass beneath us." They ducked into a narrow transit tunnel, where the roar of the crumbling forge was replaced by a heavy, pressurized silence. The walls here were ancient, etched with geometric dwarven patterns that flickered feebly in response to the ether light's proximity. Elian stumbled as another tremor shook the earth, feeling the oath stone in his pouch pulse with a frantic, warning heat. "Steady, lad," Thrain grunted, his soot-stained armor scraping against the flinty walls as they hurried deeper into the dark. They emerged into a hidden depot, where a single iron cart sat on rusted rails, its chains thick as tree trunks and waiting for a conductor. The violet cracks were present, even here, spiderwebbing across the floor, but they seemed slower, more dormant in the absence of the forge's heat. Elian climbed into the cart, the ether light resting in his lap like a small, captive sun. Its glow reflected in Thrain's weary eyes. The deep was no longer just a place of stone and iron. It was a labyrinth of shadows, and the heart of the mountain was still many miles below. Thrain took his place at the front of the cart, his large hands gripping the iron brake lever with a practiced, grim determination. With a sharp, metallic crack, the locks disengaged, and the cart began its first slow, agonizing crawl into the yawning abyss below. "The path ahead is long," Thrain whispered, his voice losing its gruff edge as the sounds of industry faded into the distance. "You'll feel the weight of the mountain pressing in, but do not let it frighten you. It's just the earth trying to remember how to breathe." As they left the last of the forge light behind, the ether light became their only world, casting a soft golden path onto the rails ahead. The air began to change, losing the biting aroma of dry pine and gaining the scent of sun-baked stone and old, sleeping iron. Elian closed his eyes for a moment, letting the rhythmic clack, clack of the wheels settle his racing heart as they descended toward the dreaming core. The iron cart began its long, steady descent into the velvet darkness of the lower tunnels. There was no sudden jerk, only a gentle forward lean as gravity took hold. Thrain placed his large, steady hand on the brake lever, and the wheels began to sing, a rhythmic, hypnotic. Clack, 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 that echoed softly against the stone walls. "Close your eyes for a moment, lad," Thrain suggested softly, his voice barely a whisper in the dark. "Feel the mountain breathing around you." Elian did as he was told. With his eyes shut, the world became a symphony of subtle sounds. The cool wind brushing past his cloak, the distant hum of the lava rivers far below, and the steady, warm pulse of the ether light in his lap. The lantern felt like a small, sleeping sun, radiating a gentle heat that kept the damp chill of the tunnels at bay. As they glided deeper, the walls of the tunnel began to glow with soft, ambient colors. They passed through veins of raw amethyst and emerald that shimmered like distant galaxies under the lantern's touch. The violet cracks they had seen earlier were here too, but in the dim light, they looked like glowing purple ivy, winding peacefully around the ancient pillars. There were no shadows to fear here, only a sense of ancient history. Elian watched as the focusing lens on his lantern projected a soft, golden path onto the rails ahead. It looked like a river of stardust guiding them home. Every turn of the wheels felt like a heartbeat, pulling them further away from the noise of the world and closer to the dreaming core of the earth. The air grew thicker and warmer, smelling of sun-baked stone and old iron. The descent was long, but it didn't feel like a struggle. It felt like a homecoming. Slowly, the steep slope began to level out, and the rhythmic song of the rails slowed to a gentle hum. A vast, open space was waiting for them at the end of the line, a place where time itself seemed to have stopped. The iron cart finally came to a complete, silent stop. The rhythmic song of the rails was gone, replaced by a stillness so absolute it felt like the mountain was holding its breath. Thrain stepped off the platform with careful, quiet movements, beckoning Elian to follow. They stood at the edge of the Mirror Deep, a vast, underground lake that stretched as far as the golden light could reach. The water was perfectly, unnaturally still. Not a single ripple disturbed its surface, making it look like a giant sheet of black glass that reflected the world above. High on the cavern ceiling, thousands of star quartz crystals pulsed with a soft, pale blue light. Their reflection in the water made it feel as though Elian and Thrain were walking on the sky itself, suspended between two heavens of shimmering stars. "Step softly, lad," Thrain whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Here, even a thought has an echo." As Elian walked along the crystal-dusted shore, the ether light in his hand softened. The golden glow began to pulse in a slow, rhythmic wave, mimicking the deep, distant thrumming that rose from beneath the water. Thump, thump, thump. It was the heart core, the living engine of the mountain. It wasn't a machine. It was a heartbeat, ancient and steady. The violet cracks that had seemed so frightening in the forge above were different here. They lay beneath the clear water like glowing purple corals, dormant and quieted by the lake's immense peace. Elian felt a wave of calm wash over him. The fear of the journey, the cold of the peaks, and the weight of his mission all seemed to dissolve into the cool, damp air. He realized that to save the mountain, he didn't need to fight. He needed to harmonize. He sat by the water's edge for a moment, watching the golden light of his lantern mingle with the blue starlight of the crystals on the water. In this deep silence, the star-bearer and the mountain were finally speaking the same language. As Elian placed the ether light onto the sacred pedestal, the air itself seemed to sigh in relief. The golden light from the sovereign spark did not burst. It unfolded like the petals of a sun-drenched flower. It moved in slow, glowing ripples across the surface of the great heart core crystal, turning the jagged violet scars into veins of pure, liquid amber. The resonance was felt throughout the entire mountain. In the great forge, the clanging of hammers stopped as the dwarves watched the dark cracks on their walls turn into paths of warm light. The world ache was fading. The deep, frantic thrumming of the earth slowed down into a rhythmic, peaceful heartbeat that echoed the steady pulse of Elian's own heart. Thrain stood in the shadows, his soot-stained face illuminated by a glow more beautiful than any fire he had ever stoked. He saw the mountain's spirit being mended, not by iron or force, but by the gentle persistence of the star-bearer's light. Elian felt a profound connection to the stone beneath him. He could feel the roots of the mountains drinking in the light, sending it up through the peaks and down into the deepest ores. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a full, rich silence, like the pause between two notes of a beautiful song. The golden amber glow filled the cavern, warming the cool air and casting soft, dancing shadows that looked like ancient spirits finally finding their rest. The walk back to the throne room was different. The halls of Iron Peak were no longer cold and tense. They were filled with the soft hum of contented machinery and the distant songs of dwarves celebrating in the lower halls. When the golden doors opened, King Borin was waiting, standing at the foot of his throne. You have done more than save a city, Starbearer, the king said, his voice deep and solemn, echoing like a drum in the vast chamber. You have healed the bones of the world. The king stepped forward, holding a small box crafted from silver and dragon scale. Inside lay a heart shard, a fragment of the newly healed core, pulsing with a steady, warm orange light. This shard is attuned to the deep, the king continued. As long as you carry it, the earth itself will recognize you as kin. It will warm you in the coldest winter and guide your steps when the path is hidden. Elian accepted the gift, feeling the shard's warmth mingle with the golden energy of his lantern. He looked back at the glowing veins of the mountain one last time, knowing he was no longer just a boy from a tower. He was a bridge between the forest and the mountain, a keeper of two worlds. The iron gates of the mountain closed with a final, echoing thud, and Elian stepped out onto the high cliffs. But the view below had changed. The great valley, usually hidden under a blanket of green, was now dominated by a sight that left him breathless. The cerulean lake, a body of water so vast it was often mistaken for a sea, was shrinking. Its silver waters were drawing back toward the center, revealing miles of wet, glistening sand and ancient stone structures that hadn't seen the sun in an age. King Borin leaned on the stone railing, looking down at the valley. The lake has been our silent neighbor for centuries, Starbearer, he whispered. But look at its heart. In the very center of the receding waters, the white spires of the sunken citadel were rising through the mist. It was a palace made of iridescent shell and polished marble, sparkling under the moonlight like a fallen star. The water isn't just disappearing, Borin added, his voice heavy with dread. It is being called. Something inside that citadel has woke up, and it is drinking the lake dry. If the water vanishes, the life of the entire valley will go with it. Elian felt the cool, damp breath of the valley floor calling to him. The ether light in his hand began to pulse with a soft, watery blue light, mimicking the ripples of a pond. The mountain was healed, but the valley was thirsty for its savior. With the heart shard glowing in his pocket and a new sense of purpose, Elian began his descent. He left the world of stone and iron behind, heading toward the shimmering sands and the silent towers of the lake. A new mystery was rising from the depths, and the Starbearer was ready to listen to what the silence had to say.